Well, it's 3:15, so I think we should get started. Good afternoon, history buffs. Thank you for joining us for a stroll down memory lane back to planning in the 1960s and 1970s. My name is Larry Mintier. I'm a planning consultant. One time an OPR employee, and along with, I sure can. Okay, I'll lean into it. Along with Steve Preston, we are the two co-historians for the California chapter of American Planning Association. So the idea for this session really started with a comment. I guess maybe Julia, you were there in the room at that time, and the question was, well, we're coming up to the 40th anniversary of the urban strategy, and we ought to somehow commemorate that. But that rapidly evolved into a larger discussion about, yeah, well, what about those decades of the 60s and 70s and what was going on? And because they really were notable, those 2 decades were really notable for these big planning concepts and really ambitious schemes. These schemes that we're talking about are all state level, so they're not local general plans, okay? That's what we're talking about today, are state level planning. Well, you'll understand more about this as we get into it. But the schemes and proposals were geographically inclusive. They were statewide. They weren't like the Coastal Act or BCDC, right? They were statewide. They were topically inclusive, and they dealt with land use and circulation and infrastructure and natural resources. So some dealt with education, some in fact dealt with health. So they were broad in terms of their topical coverage. And they all sought to define appropriate roles for state and local government in terms of shaping the future. No, it's not state, I say state and local, state, regional, and local government, and trying to come up with a good plan for how you allocate responsibilities among them for shaping the future of California. And at this point, let me introduce the panel members. First is Steve Preston. Again, he's my co-chair for history in California Chapter APA. He's city manager of San Gabriel, and prior to joining San Gabriel, he served as a planner in Laverne and Glendale. He's been a long member of ICMA, as it would befit a city manager, and he's contributed a chapter on management to ICMA's most recent volume on community planning. He's also authored a chapter in the anthology Planning Los Angeles, issued by the Cal Press, or the APA Press, rather. And most recently, Steve received the APA President's Award for Outstanding Leadership in the planning movement. And more recently, I mean, just I guess in the spring issue of JAPA, he co-authored an article on comparing the ethical requirements for AICP and ICMA. Bill Fulton, who you know from his California days, he's living now in Houston, and we're grateful that he could escape the flooding to be here today. But he's the director of the Kinder Institute for Urban Research at Rice University. He's former planning director, former mayor of Ventura and director of planning and economic development for the city of San Diego. So there's a prior. He also served as vice president for Smart Growth America. He was a principal in PlaceWorks planning firm. And he's been a senior fellow. I don't know whether you still are, Bill, a senior fellow at the Saul Price School of Public Policy at USC. And he's the founding editor and publisher of California Planning and Development Report, which we've read for years, and is author of 5 books, including The Guide to California Planning, which is being reissued in an updated version. Our third panelist is David Booher, and David's had a long career doing many different things in the public and private sector as a planner, lobbyist, scholar, teacher, consultant. Most recently, he's been associated with the Center for Collaborative Policy, and he's an author of many articles and is co-author with Judith Innes, who's here today, of Planning with Complexity, an Introduction to Collaborative Rationality for Public Policy. And the second edition of that book will soon be released. Dave was Cal Chapter APA president back in 1979, 1980, and he was the founder of the California Planning Roundtable about the same time. So, let's get on to it. We've got a lot to cover. We're going to be talking about the 60s and 70s, but I want to start with some deep background that goes back about 100 years. And by the way, I've got a timeline that has essentially the same information. Could you pass copies of that around? There are more people here than there are copies, but it's basically the same thing you're going to see on the screen. It is not the PowerPoint itself, but and I've got copies of all these reports that we'll be talking about. So, before the 1960s, in this period that we're going to be focusing on, for 50 years, there was an ongoing effort to define the role of state government and local government, again, in managing the future of the state of California. And it began as far back as 1913 with Governor Hiram Johnson's 1913 Commission of Immigration and Housing. That's not a typo. Commission of Immigration and Housing. And then every few years there was a new idea for how to deal with those issues, and for 50 years or so there were a whole succession of these commissions and departments, and they didn't last long and they didn't produce a whole lot. And that carried on right through the 1950s. Anyway, for 50 years in California, we had all these different efforts to kind of figure out what to do about organizing land use planning, transportation planning, and so forth. And that really didn't produce very much until we got to 1959. And what you'll see here is I've added in, here are the 50 years leading up to the 1960s, and these feckless efforts really to carve out a logical arrangement at the state level for dealing with these broad issues. So we got Pat Brown elected in 1958, created a new political environment, and I put these dates in for context. Important thing happened in 1959. Finally, this notion of big thinking kind of kicked in with the state planning law, established the Office of Planning in the Department of Finance. And they were charged, OPR, this is a precursor, the State Planning Office was charged with developing a comprehensive development plan. Okay, that's the important takeaway from that experience. Nothing happened immediately. In 1962, we had a nonprofit educational environmental group called California Tomorrow, and they published a report called California Going, and it was basically a broadside and just really took on all the ills of resulting from the rapid growth in California, and looked forward and talked about how awful things were going to be in the future, and it railed against I love this, the slurs. You see that down there? I'm sure they invented this term. Our sloppy, sleazy, slovenly, slipshod semi-cities. So that's the devil they defined in this report.
Larry, do you want me to hold these publications up as you talk about them?
Oh, that would be great. Thanks. And now they're in reverse order here.
All right.
So, But their main recommendation was get on with developing this state development plan. Just do it. It's overdue, do it. So that was the message out of that report. Then a couple sidebars, BCDC was created, Ronald Reagan was elected in 1966, but in 63, in fact, the state planning office did get on it in terms of developing the state development plan. They called it the State Development Plan Program, and Paul can tell us why that was in a few minutes. It was just a massive undertaking. There were actually 2 reports that came out of that effort. This is the first one, and that was published in 1965. It was sort of a reconnaissance report, and then in 1968, a really massive publication was released, and in fact, I think there must have been volumes and volumes and volumes of background documents in addition to that. That report contained over 100 recommendations. By my count, it must have been more like 200. I got tired after reading through this document. This program was transmitted to the world over Ronald Reagan's signature, but it was never formally adopted. It wasn't adopted by the legislature, and it wasn't formally adopted by Governor Reagan. A couple more sidebars. Tahoe, 2 agencies were created to deal with that regional issue, and the Office of Planning and Research was created in 1970. But no mandate to do a state development plan. Then we have this same group that published that earlier report, California Tomorrow. They published the California Tomorrow Plan. And what they did was take business as usual and compare it to what could be if we were smart and engaged in smart planning. And that was developed by a 13-member task force. But, you know, they really had some heavy hitters behind that report. Here's just a partial list of people that were involved. Nat Owings, Harvey Perloff, Bill Wheaton, Tom Bradley, Willie Brown, Cy Eisner, T.J. Kent, and Wallace Stegner, among others. So anyway, the important thing to remember about that report is that they made this, again, there was this notion of creating a state development plan or a state plan or a state land use plan. And there was also another important recommendation that has some continuity, and that was to create regional governments in California. So divide the state up in 10 regions and create a council for each of those. So there in 1973, the newly created Office of Planning and Research published the Environmental Goals and Policy Report, and in some ways it reads sort of like a cross between a policy report and a technical report. But if you read the quote on this page, you'll see that there was this notion that there should be a comprehensive land use policy in California, and this report says, but this isn't it, but we're laying the foundations for it, and we'll come back to this issue a little bit later. So, 1974, Jerry Brown's elected governor, starts in 1975. At the same time, another organization, Planning and Conservation Foundation, published its report, and Paul Sedway was a key player in producing the background report to the policy report, again, another task force. And lo and behold, key recommendation, create a state land use council to coordinate land use planning of all state departments and agencies and to develop a comprehensive state land use plan. So here we are again, calling for this. And, by the way, create comprehensive area-wide planning councils. So there are a couple major themes that carry through all these efforts. Okay, we get to the last major milestone during these 2 decades. It was the publication. I'm sorry, I'm one slide behind. Where are we? Okay, here we are in the urban strategy. Okay, we're synced up now. And this was published as a partial update of the environmental goals and policy report. It wasn't produced in terms of a direct mandate from that 1970 law that created OPR, it's a relatively short report. I mean, it's only 36 pages long. It has 3 priorities for future growth: renew and maintain existing urban areas, do infill on vacant land and underutilized land, and thirdly, if absolutely necessary, go outside, but make it compact and make it contiguous. And so there were also, in addition to those priorities, like 45 programs, a lot of legislation, and a lot of administrative recommendations. So, interestingly, Bill Press, a year later, now Bill Press had been with CPF, and he'd been hired by Jerry Brown to head up the Office of Planning and Research. So there's also some continuity there. And he did a report like a year after the urban strategy had been adopted, and talked about all the legislation, and didn't do badly given what came a few months after the release of the urban strategy, which was Prop 13. And so that just changed everything in California. And it passed by nearly 2/3, and of course, everybody knows what Prop 13 did. And it was just a game changer. But despite all that, you know, we still did pretty well in terms of implementing a lot of things in the urban strategy. In 1982, George Deukmejian was elected governor, and that was sort of the end of the road for OPR in terms of what it had been under the Brown administration. Okay, with that, I want to turn to my panel, and they're each going to talk for about 10 minutes. And we agreed early on when we were trying to design this panel, this session, that there were at least 3 questions that we wanted to talk about and try to answer, probably many more. But number 1, what did we learn from all these grandiose, big thinking proposals? Secondly, why did we give up on trying to do this by the end of the 1970s? And third, how well have we gotten along without these grand schemes? Because we just stopped doing this in California. So those are 3 questions, and I'm going to turn it over first to Steve. Again, each of the panel members is going to talk for about 10 minutes, and then we'll go to questions from you and a special set of guests that we have here in the first few rows, people that were involved in a lot of these efforts going back into the 60s and the 70s. Steve?
Thank you, Larry. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. In honor of the technology problems we're having on the dais today, I'm pleased to announce that I will be doing my presentation completely using finger puppets. Each of us comes at a process like this from a little different perspective, and I have to admit I kind of chortled when Larry asked me to serve on this panel. You've heard the grand timeline of how these planning efforts unfolded. I was in college when the last of these reports was being issued. I was 1.5 years old when the State Planning Office was created. And so that means I'm approaching this with a little different perspective than some folks might who are actively engaged in the profession during the years that these reports had their greatest currency. On the other hand, the fact that I'm passionate about planning history and that I serve with Larry as the co-historian for the chapter means I get to see a lot of these documents because as folks retire, they contribute their documents to the California chapter's archives, which are housed at Cal State Northridge. And at that archive, virtually every one of these reports can be found, and sometimes sets of notes or comments or other intermediary documents that relate to them. So I don't study these documents the way those who were here working in the period might have understood them. I'm looking at them, in a sense, as archival documents and trying to see what I learn from that history. And so with that sort of set of biases, I'm going to offer first a few thoughts on what we might learn by looking at these documents. The first is that, let me just ask, how many people in this room were born after 1980? Show of hands. All right, so maybe a fifth of the room was born after 1980. That means you probably never even learned about a fair number of these documents if you were in planning school in California. If you went somewhere else, you might not have learned about them at all. What strikes me is that if I were to come into a presentation like this and people just talked about these reports, I might tend to think these were all cut from the same cloth. But as you've heard in Larry's presentation, these are very different takes on how to approach planning from a statewide perspective. Some of them are what you might call calls to action. They're attempts to engage and maybe even enrage the public to take some action to save a California that, particularly in the 1960s and 70s, was increasingly being seen as being lost to some form of overdevelopment. Others of these reports are technical reports, and as Larry said, some of these we held up and they're fairly thin reports, but they are buttressed by reams and reams of documentation. And what is fascinating to me is to think how easily we can amass piles of data today in support of our plans, and what sort of effort it must have taken in the mid-1960s to compile the level of data that was supporting the analysis in the plans that Larry has referenced for you. That being said, I would also say there's something that strikes me about some of these plans. I hate to say this again for those of you who came along after 1980, I hate to tell you, but we are a lot more jaundiced population than the generation of planners that put together many of these plans. These plans in some cases have, it might be even too dismissive to say, there's a sweetness and a naivete at places to the argument and the recommendations in these plans, because in some cases, the plans are written with the belief that there could be a single unitary process and action on how to move forward in California that could gain broad public acceptance. Now, we know that that public acceptance can occur because it's occurred in a whole host of ways in this state. The adoption of the Coastal Act, for example, is a good example. But the sense that the state had perhaps a more singular way of getting to an outcome in these plans is something that strikes me as different from the way we often approach plans today. I'm not suggesting that the authors of these plans didn't know what they were doing. I'm saying they were living in a culturally different state than the state of today. Many of the plans tend to be positive rather than punitive. I look at a lot of plans today and they seem to be technical efforts to cut and slice and dice every possibility so you can't do something wrong. These were much broader, typically, and more visionary plans about how we were going to structure ourselves to control growth. And that's part of what I think makes them unique. That being said, one of the things that I think is different about problem solving today from the way it was being approached in these plans is that as we've become more and more convinced as a society that we are sufficiently diverse and complex, that there are no easy answers, we end up nibbling more and more at the edges of problem solving. Now, I'm going to cast a knowing glance over to Janet Ruggiero, because Janet and I have spent a good chunk of this legislative season looking at more than 50 mostly terrible proposals on what to do with state housing law that exemplify exactly the principle I'm describing. Having given up the field on the ability to solve problems on a global and holistic scale, the state legislature has moved to increasingly narrow nibbles at the edges of a problem that end up not solving the problem. And that is one of the big differences, and perhaps one of the lessons we should learn is not to be entirely scared of doing that big picture thinking. Some of these plans speak with a level of opinion and verve that would be considered frightening today. I see this as being somewhere on a continuum. For those of you who studied the Great City Beautiful plans of the 1920s, which were typically framed by very small teams or by single authors, some of those plans were almost lyrical in their writing because they were expressing a very singular and individual vision. As time went on, by the time we got to the 60s, these plans were much more complex. They had much greater sets of data attached, but there is still a sense of positiveness and affirmation in some of these documents. It says, we got a big problem here, but we also have a solution. There was an optimism about these plans that is not consistently apparent in the plans of today. The challenge that these plans have had, that caused them, I think, to struggle so much, is that in every case there had to be a legislative or political consensus that would move those documents forward. And we kind of laugh today. We say, oh, well, yeah, well, that's not going to happen. This is California, the state that a few years ago was being described as ungovernable by people. But in fact, it is possible to get legislative and political consensus. It happens in different ways. It has happened even in recent years on issues, including climate change, for example, where this state has stepped out in front of other states. But I would also say that these plans were developed in an era of state reform generally, in which we believe that actions being taken at the state level were going to make us unique among the 50 states. We were the first state to have a fully professionalized, year-round legislature. And I believe that the thinking that informed these plans believed that with that quality and purpose set forth in our legislative process, that you would be able to advance big picture plans like these and have them be acted on. But it didn't happen for some of the same reasons that today we look back on the decisions of how our legislature was structured in the 60s and wonder if we actually managed to get that all right. And then, of course, necessity is the mother of invention. Until governments and the people they represent see a threat, they're often unlikely to rally around a big picture solution. And it's hard to get that sense of threat assessment to stick on a statewide basis. So why did we give up on this kind of big picture thinking? Well, I would argue that California was always less homogeneous than citizens at large believe it was. I believe planners in the state always understood the complexity of our population. But I think it was easy to present arguments to a community of people in this state who saw themselves as being more unified. A lot of that unity fell apart during the tumultuous times of the 1960s and early 1970s. I think there was a thought that grand plans could be implemented by that professionalized year-round legislature. I think there was a sense that we might be ready to challenge some very California traditions like local control and the general distrust of government that still shadow the state today. The volumes of data we can amass today are mind-boggling. We can do things today that would have been very challenging for the authors of these plans to do in the 1960s and 70s. But they defy the easy aspect of those plans, which relied on the data that could be acquired and was available, a thinner but sometimes more direct stream of information to inform those plans. And then ultimately, part of the reason I think we've given up on this type of thinking is that we've lost faith in technocracy as the solution to our problems. Now, I will dispute the argument that nobody ever tried to do big picture planning afterwards. I think, for example, some of us who were active in APA California in the late 80s and early 90s remember the efforts by then Governor Wilson, having come from a successful career moderating growth in the San Diego area, making a grand promise to issue a statewide plan to control growth. That plan never got out the gate. It was to be announced at a Cal chapter conference that was being held on the day that the Oakland Hills fire broke out. The governor did appear at the conference and never again said a word about the statewide growth plan. It just it was like it never existed. And while there were some efforts after that to sort of generate some interest in the subject, it never happened really during the Wilson administration and has not happened well since. So the final question we're asked to answer is, how well have we gotten along without that grand statewide framework? Well, I'm going to argue that not everything is being done without a grand framework. I'll tell you that the first time I read the first generation of the ARB's scoping plan, I was amazed at how broad and extensive it was in its reach, into various facets of California government at all levels. And in that respect, I would say that the scoping plan actually met all of the criteria that Larry outlined as being the subject of those grand plans of the past. But they're happening in different ways, and they're not happening necessarily within the narrow realm of what we constitute as the planners. So with that, that gives you a little sense of my thought on the three questions that Larry has posed.
Well, thank you, Steve, and I'm going to turn it over to Bill Fulton.
Thank you, Larry. I have a similar perspective to Steve because I'm a little younger than the people who were involved in this, and I moved to California in 1981. Within a year or so, as a journalist, I was writing about planning and fiscal issues. I would peg my first telephone call to Peter Detweiler in about 1982. That was, that's kind of, if you were a journalist writing about local government, that's how you peg when your whole timing is the first time you call Peter Detweiler. And in fact, one of the things I remember Peter telling me once was, and I think is apropos of this history panel, is that he was once entertaining a group of officials from another country, and they were talking about the histories of planning in their relative countries, and he said to them, you don't realize we've been doing planning in California for a long time. We passed our first general plan law in 1927. And then he realized that the visitors in his office were from Egypt, which had been doing planning for 3,500 years. And he was embarrassed. So I think that we have to bear in mind that even as we celebrate the history of California planning, it's still pretty young. I would say I want to make a couple of points. I want to make a couple of points, and then we'll go through these. Larry will go through these. I want to echo what Steve said, and I want to then at the end make a point. I know that a lot of people think that the world ended when Prop 13 passed, or alternatively when Jerry Brown left office the first time. And in many ways that's true. But I think it's important to understand that the attempt to, as Steve said, the attempt to create the grand bargain for planning and growth management in California continued all through the 1980s. And many of you will remember the major effort in 1988 by Willie Brown to try to make that happen. And then when Pete Wilson came in, as Steve said, perhaps the most prominent growth management mayor in the country becomes the governor of California. Growth management is a subject of a topic of debate between Dianne Feinstein and Pete Wilson in 1990. And then, for a variety of reasons, including a recession and his need to increase the tax revenue, Pete Wilson moved to the right very significantly when he was governor, and that was the end. But it's not really the end, I don't think, of big thinking about planning in California, as Steve said. So let me just talk, because one of the things I want to convey is we still are doing the same, attempting to do the same things we've been doing for the last 40 years. So if you go, Larry, just go on to look at the goals of the urban strategy. Adequate supply of affordable housing, curbing wasteful urban sprawl, protecting the state's natural environment. Does any of this sound familiar? Encouraging land use patterns in a manner that stimulate necessary development with protecting environmental quality. I mean, that all sounds like what we're trying to do today. If you move on, Larry, to the blank screen, if you move on to my next slide, which is here somewhere, I'm sure, AB 857, 2002. Anybody remember that? This is the existing state policy of what the state government is supposed to do with every action. It is promote infill development. If you can't have infill development, promote, contiguous development, and protect natural and, basically natural and working landscapes. 15 years ago, this is a pretty big deal for a variety of reasons. This was never implemented. And for those of you who remember your more recent history, the implementation plan for AB 857 was brought out by the Gray Davis administration at 11 a.m. on the day that Arnold Schwarzenegger took office at noon, which is why it didn't get acted upon. And then moving on to the next slide, I think you'll see some, you know, here's the Strategic Growth Council goals: protect natural resources and agricultural lands. This is from 2008. This is 2008. Revitalize communities and urban centers. I think the point is, no matter what the frame has been, the themes have always been the same, and we're trying to do the same things now that we were trying to do 40 years ago. In fact, I don't know if this story is apocryphal, but the story I always heard about the release of the urban strategy was that Jerry had been sitting on it for a long time, and he went to the Governors Association conference. Is this right, Peter? You must have told me this. And Mike Dukakis reveals his Massachusetts urban strategy, and Jerry turns around and says, Bill, where's that thing we've been working on? He says to Bill Press. And Bill Press hands it to him because, like a good staff guy, he had it ready just in case. And Jerry brought it out. But though, if you go back and look at the themes, you know, the goals of the urban strategy, those are exactly the same. And I would say that and I want to amplify what Steve said and said, there is no grander planning strategy than to try to solve global climate change at the state level, right? And there is, and if you think about AB 32 and SB 375, then what you see is an attempt at the state level to use planning strategies, not imposed entirely on local governments in a binding way, but to use planning strategies to reduce VMT, which essentially means reducing driving. Okay? It is our state policy to reduce driving. That is our state policy under SB 2008 and AB 32. That's an enormously ambitious big goal that is driving everything in this state right now and is driving us toward exactly the same goals that we've always had. As Steve says, it's just in a different frame. And just because planners didn't dream it up and it's not about, it doesn't have the word planning attached to it, doesn't mean that that's what we're doing. So I would argue that on the one hand, we continue to have big ideas frame planning in California. In answer to the last question, how have we muddled along for the last 35 years, I would say that's the result of the disconnect between these big ideas, which have continuously come along, including the climate change stuff, and the rules that apply to local governments to do local planning, which, as Fred Silva said in the last panel about housing, is it's all about process, right? It's all about process. It's not about outcome, right? And so I think the legacy that we see is a state that has pretty consistently, with about a 20-year gap, I'd say, attempted to throw the long ball and do big things on planning and development, but has never been willing to connect that up to the day-to-day planning work that all of us do, that all of you do, in order to have a unified system. So that was pretty much all I see. Is the era of big policy drivers over? No. So there you go. Thanks very much.
And David Booher.
Thank you. So I want to pick up a little bit on what you were saying in terms of what we've learned from these. And that was a great list of many of these substantive policies are still floating around in various stages. I want to focus on the process question in terms of what we've learned from these. But going back to before going to the why we haven't done more. So all of these plans, several of the process issues still are out there and around and still very important. Let me give you an example. The whole concept of demographic and economic projections driving these things, these development plans, is still here. I mean, those still rebounds are out. The idea of having decision makers provided with the best data and information to at least improve the knowledge base that they have. So we have, OPR is still using, and the original development plan, the idea was here was all this data that advisors could use to inform decision-making by the legislature and the governor. And so, at least the last time I checked, OPR is still a very significant player in terms of providing advice to the governor and the legislature about these development issues. The concept of that state agencies should coordinate their development, that was in the original plans. That's still very much out there with the Strategic Growth Council, that idea, and that the knowledge, the data should inform those decisions. That seems to me to still be part of the process. And then this idea of regional coordination of some kind, regional cooperation, that continues to rebound. It's, with the Sustainable Communities Act and in a host of different ways, we still are focused on trying to make sense out of the regional coordination. So there would be others, but I think those are some of the key aspects that we've learned from these that are process-oriented to go along with some of the substantive ideas that are still very important. On why we didn't do this, why this isn't going on anymore. I guess I don't. I think there's like 3 things I want to talk about. The first is the Friends of Mammoth decision on CEQA, which basically said a lot of people thought CEQA was to apply to projects that were done by public agencies. Jack Knox used to say, I don't know if this is true or not, Fred, but Jack Knox used to say that the Republican leadership of the Assembly came to him and told him he was going to carry CEQA and that this was what was going to be in it, and they were going to put it through. Of course, they had control of the legislature then, so they could. But in the Friends of Mammoth case, which I think was like 1972, the Supreme Court said, no, it applies to all projects that government approves. So now CEQA suddenly applied to private projects. And that had enormous ramifications, especially for a lot of people who didn't think that was going to happen, who didn't realize that was the case. And it had a major effect on development issues. That, along with my second one, Prop 13, I've always looked at as like the black hole of planning energy in California. It's like it sucked everything in. You had to deal with CEQA, and suddenly in 1978, with Prop 13, it had enormous ramifications. It'd be hard to even count them all, direct, indirect, in terms of decision-making and planning, not only for the state, but for local governments. So those were 2 very big developments that really kind of put the kibosh on this kind of big thinking, because a lot of people were so focused on those. The third thing I want to bring out is an article that was published in, I think it was 1972, by Mel Weber and Horst Riddle. It's kind of a classic article. It was called the Dilemmas for a General Theory of Planning. This is the one that talked about wicked planning problems or wicked problems. Okay? Basically, it said you can't solve these problems by doing planning the way we're doing it. This kind of big thinking with the experts in their technical analysis, and then formulating what the problem is, and then formulating solutions. Because, well, first you can't even figure out what the problem is because we're so diverse. We have so many diverse interests and values that are usually in conflict. You can never establish what the problem is. And then secondly, even if you could, you can't figure out a solution because you can't figure out what the problem is. And it's always changing. And it has so many ramifications, you can never fully track through what your solution is going to do to everything else. So basically, this whole idea of being able to do these big plans using, with the experts back in the room, going through the rational planning analysis, figuring out what should be done, doesn't work. And that leads me to the final point I wanted to bring to the discussion here, is the New Jersey State Plan, Development Plan. In 1985, so 1985, the legislature enacted a law requiring the development of a state development plan for New Jersey. And it required it to be a collaborative process. So it created a stakeholder-type commission, and they set about this plan, and 5 years later, they were able to adopt a state development plan for New Jersey, 1992. That was by consensus. I mean, everybody agreed this was the way to go. And Weber and Riddle pointed to this approach in their article when they talked about the second generation of approach really required a much more adaptive, collaborative, participatory, transdisciplinary approach than the kind of a planning approach that we had come to think about up until that time. And that's pretty much what happened in New Jersey. Judy and I, in our book, you mentioned our book, talk about this case study in there. I've got some handouts if you want to get a 20% off on the third edition. So, is it still happening? Well, I don't know. I'm not convinced that greenhouse gas emissions, I think that's big thinking, but I'm not sure that's the same as a comprehensive plan. You know, and some of these things are big. I mean, what happened in Tahoe was big thinking. That was a big deal, what they did with the Tahoe Regional Compact. But, so to throw into the mix here, I would just call out the statewide water plan, which had always been, I mean, it's required every 5 years or so. It had always been a technical document. And it was like 1998 or so, the legislature and the stakeholders really got upset with the state water plan that had been issued then. And so the new administration came in with a new person, Jonas Minton, who decided he was going to do the state water plan was going to be a collaborative process. And so they organized a committee, 66 or so stakeholders. They had a broader advisory group of 360, and they spent 5 years and came up with a consensus state water plan. I think it was 2005. That, by all accounts, was much more responsive and much more in keeping with what the state needed. And so that's an example of how I would like to see big thinking go in the future. Thank you.
Well, I think there are two takeaways, at least for me. I think I'm the only one up here who hasn't published recently or reissued a book. So that distinguishes me from those distinguished people up here. The panel, and the other take home was that we just don't talk about a state land use plan any longer or a state development plan. It's like it's dropped out of our vocabulary. And there may be things that collectively get there or largely get there, but I haven't heard any talk in recent years, again, about a state development plan, some comprehensive grand scheme that tries to rationalize the system in California for guiding development. So we're going to go into the Q&A session, but I want to do something a little different here because we invited a group of special guests, and most all of them have shown up today. And these are people who were involved in the 60s and 70s. They were either directly involved or keen observers of what was going on. And I wanted to give them the first shot, the first 20 minutes or so, to ask questions or make observations about their experience during that period. Now, there are a few people who came along later, but I know that they're very keenly interested in this topic. So let me just go down the row here. Fred Silva. Fred Silva was, I'll just say a few words about each person. Fred Silva was at OPR the first day I got there, and it was sort of a bridge between the Reagan administration and the Brown administration, and he rapidly went off to the Senate Local Government Committee. So we didn't lose him to the discussion, he just started wearing a new hat. Vivian Kahn was at OPR. She headed up the local government unit, was involved in drafting the urban strategy. Paul Sedway may be the person who's had the most direct involvement in the plans that I talked about. The state development plan, he was a major contributor to that, and then the PCF plan in the 70s. Judith Ennis is next to, well, I'm sorry, Mike Tietz was an observer of all this and a participant, but he was doing that from the vantage point of the UC Berkeley campus, where he was chairman of the Department of City and Regional Planning. So he was keenly interested in this and followed it very closely, and next to him is his colleague Judith Ennis, who's also the co-author with Dave of the book that we were just talking about. So Janet Ruggiero has been involved in every major planning effort since, I don't know, since the day she graduated. Since the day she graduated from planning school. And so she's not only been a major player and major force in the regional planning, but in state planning, national planning. And so she's deeply invested in the role of the state in land use planning. Tom Jacobson, he's probably the youngest in the group here, but he worked with Dan Curtin shortly after leaving law school, but he became an academic. But I know that he's keenly interested in this topic, and we've spent a lot of time talking about these same issues. Peter Detweiler, also at the Office of Planning Research, he and I started about the same time, and he headed up the legislative unit and the local government unit, and then at the end of the Brown administration, he followed Fred at the Senate Office of Research. I'm sorry, Senate Local Government, but there were people who left OPR to go to SOR, but you're right, the Senate Local Government Committee, and so, and then Dennis Castrillo, colleague of mine at OPR in the local government unit, a named contributor to the urban strategy. Steve Sanders is someplace. Oh, there's Steve. Steve, again, he wasn't involved in those efforts, but he was working for the Senate Office of Research and did a lot of writing after the fact that was sort of a continuation of this discussion. So anyway, I wanted to open it up to these folks in the first couple rows here to share any observations you have and just add to the discussion, and we'll do that for the next 20 minutes or so before we open it up to everybody else. So I'm going to have to use, or we're going to have to use this. Testing? Nope. Hello? Now it's working. Okay. So I'm going to bring down the microphone, and just what I'm going to do is just throw it up in the air like a wedding bouquet to see who grabs it.
Peter promised if we let him ask a question, he'd give us uncontrolled chaos.
Peter, you want to start? Okay.
I do, because I want to agree, as I like to do, with Bill Fulton. And you know, that part about the Egyptians wasn't entirely true. All they were up to is they had a pyramid scheme. Da-dum. But I think you're right, that the concepts endure, the framing is different. And that was the takeaway, that's what I took away from your presentation. And I think that works really well with what Larry and the panel had to say. And I think the framing has come in two ways. And let's see if these more experienced people agree with me. First of all, our regional efforts. And some of those are formal. So TRPA and the Coastal Commission, BCDC, even predating TRPA. So there have been these formal efforts over time to apply broad policies to very particular local controversies. And then the second way that that's carried out regionally is, and I'm optimistic about this, is the increased activity by COGS. And this not a capital N, capital F, but sort of a new federalism at the local level that really, I think, is beginning to show progress that COGS didn't show us in the 70s and 80s and 90s. Which kind of then gets, so that's my first cause for optimism, or the framing of these regional efforts. The second are the topical efforts. So whether it's the state water plan redo that Jonas Minton did in this more collaborative way, or whether it's the first scoping plan by the California Air Resources Board, or Louise Bedworth's recent efforts at OPR to frame it more in terms of sustainable goals. It's not just packaging, it's not just branding, it's not just labeling, but it is a different frame, and that does give me some optimism. Where my optimism is tempered is in the need for political leadership. And if you look at other states, if you look at Florida's grand experiment, certainly the New Jersey experiment, and other efforts around the country, the essence of it has been political leadership. I always maintained that OPR during the Brown administration was only as good as the governor wanted it or allowed it to be, and there was some leadership there that took some bold risks and mostly got away with it. But clearly Duke Majan blew the place up, you know, and got rid of a lot of my friends. And thank you, Fred, for getting me out of there early. Pete Wilson, I think you're right. And that was maybe our most optimistic time to have managed growth in California. And his political ambitions and other problems sidetracked that. Gray Davis squandered an opportunity. There was a guy who had the opportunity to spend political capital, and he hoarded it, and well, we know what happened. And then, you know, Arnold Schwarzenegger, who when asked, what about your Office of Planning and Research? He said, they neither plan nor research. I'm not sure why we have it. So there was never any political support for statewide effort. And so I think that's essential. That executive political leadership, having worked for the legislature for 30 years, I despair at strong political leadership emerging because of the consensus. The terrific work that you did, Steve, did not come to fruition because the legislature cannot lead on this issue. And I think that is a national observation among the 50 states, that the states that succeed because of executive political leadership. And that's something that I think planners and the rest of us need to stay focused on. Thank you.
Yeah, let me follow up on Peter's notion. I would suggest to always be wary of that list of bills that Bill put up and that Dave talked about, because a statute isn't going to do it. Some time ago, I was asked by a group of staff people, one of the constitutional officers, about, gee, Fred, why can't we figure out a statute that our boss would support that would have a comprehensive urban development, resource management proposal, and a 5-year infrastructure planning program? Why can't we have that? And I said, you know, there's a provision in the government code that outlines exactly that in the OPR statute, and the other is, in fact, there's a statute that creates a fairly comprehensive 5-year capital improvement plan, and it's supposed to be integrated with the state budgeting process, and just go read the statutes. And I got this call back and said, gee, we don't see there's a need to do a bill. And I said, no, And part of the dilemma that has been suggested up here is it isn't that there's this magic elixir in a statute that can fix this stuff. Individual issues, energy, some others, are pretty well accustomed to having a statute that deals with them in a fairly narrow topic. But the kinds of things that Paul Sedway and others have been urging isn't simply a statutory provision, it is what Peter suggested, and that's political leadership and some form of a consensus about it. The last time we had I think I have this right, but I will stand corrected, that we had a state legislator who put together a statute for a proposed state development plan and commission was Paul Priolo, the then Republican majority leader who did that in I don't remember, but his staff in the committee that he also chaired, I think this was just before he was the Republican leader, was a fairly comprehensive document. And from time to time, because I had kept a copy of it, I would hand it to people and say, you should read this. And people go, wow, that was a Republican that suggested that. So political leadership is important. I don't think you have much of that at this era. You had it in another era. So those who are looking ahead to 2019 need to think about how that next administration handles the statutes that are right available to them.
Thanks. Paul?
I was thinking back about the work we did on the state development plan and some of the comments that were made by the panel today. And it was clear to us when we embarked on this monumental effort that the goals that we initially set were totally unachievable given the constraints that we had in California. And I mention that because I worked on one of the series of reports which led us to the conclusion that we really couldn't plan for the state. The state was unplannable, it was too big. But more significantly, we couldn't achieve the plan because of the limitations imposed by the Constitution and by the local home rule that we were given. And we did very detailed studies of the state laws relating to planning and to related subjects, intergovernmental relations. We worked on those with Hal Wise and with Bill Spangle. And we came to the conclusion that clearly we needed a different kind of arena for our planning, and that was going to be the regional level. And so we in fact divided up, I didn't, but the leaders of the effort divided up the state into 3 parts, and they gave each part of the state to another consultant. The North was given to Larry Livingston, the middle part of the state was given to Bob Grunwald, and the South was given to Cy Eisner. And this was supposed to be an effort at achieving more manageable planning settings and to get into the regional scale. It was hard for us to really move it into that scale because of what the original goals of the effort were. But as we're talking about this today, it seems to me that in terms of will we really have big plans again, I am convinced we will have big plans again. And those will be plans at the regional scale. They will be coming soon because a lot of the issues that we are beginning to address can only be addressed at the regional scale. And that will be our salvation. We won't come up with a state plan, but I think we'll come up with something that was given birth to in the state development plan and on which I am proud to have worked.
I guess that Paul and I, excuse me, are probably the oldest of this group. I'm not sure. But my connection with the State Development Plan came through Jack Dykeman at Berkeley. after I arrived there in 1963, Jack came shortly after and immediately got a big contract from the State Development Plan effort, and we all went to work one way and another. And my modest, indeed exceedingly modest contribution to that was an incredibly obscure report on the principles for land use classification that should go into the State Development Plan. It was actually very, very interesting, very academic, a lot of fun, and we were quite enthusiastic about the whole process. I think that I certainly agree with much of what's been said by other people today, that the prospect for a state-level planning effort are probably not that great. But I've been a regionalist for 65 years, I guess, and I'm never willing to quite give up hope, even though we are disappointed over and over.
I had a couple personal observations as I was putting together this timeline. One is that this notion of regional government or regional agencies was so persistent, and it goes back goes back decades, way before 1960. But in each of these milestone or landmark reports, they came back to the issue of we've got to solve problems at a regional level. We can't do it at the local, and we can't do it effectively at the state. So this regional issue was a big, really compelling all the way through. The other thing was that all these efforts that we've been talking about had a decidedly Northern California bias. None of them actually came out of Southern California. They all came out of Northern California. They all came out of the Bay Area or Sacramento, which I found really interesting. So, other people in this group that would like to... What's that? Well, that's right. They did make a contribution. So, any other... Tom?
Thanks, Larry. Well, I did share an experience with Bill Fulton, more than one, but one in particular he mentioned. When I first started practicing law with the late Dan Curtin, and I was puzzling over some provision of planning law, couldn't make sense of it, went down to Dan's corner office and asked him what it meant, and he, and those of you who knew Dan, knew that sort of barely concealed sense of impatience, and said, well, have you called Peter Detweiler yet? and I hadn't. I hung my head and went back to my office and called Peter, and Peter explained it. So yes, that was a milestone in many careers. The other thing is this has all been, this is really emotional for me. And the emotion is one of gratitude. I was lucky enough to study with Judy Innes and Mike Tietz and Paul Sedway at Cal in graduate school in planning. And Jack Kent, every Friday afternoon meeting with Jack Kent marked my life, and many, many others. And then looking at these planning documents and recognizing what they represented, and Larry, you used the word optimism. The optimism it engendered, even though we knew things were hard and didn't get done, but a sense of optimism, like this is a career worth pursuing because. So giants walked the earth in those days, and to sort of hear this, I was ready to start a standing ovation, and maybe it's a little premature, but at some point before we leave today, we're going to thank all these people because they did so much.
Are we done in this group? Okay. Steve. Pardon? Steve? Got a thought? Two? Sure. Three?
One thing I think all of you have said, that there's a through line in these things, and you can sort of say it's a planning document, went on a shelf, maybe some of those ideas and those themes came through, but throughout, you know, David and I shared the failed experiment with the Wilson administration. If Dianne Feinstein had won rather than Pete Wilson, that would have happened in the 90s, actually. And so leadership is, as you're right, Peter, leadership is really, really critical. But leaders pick up what they have and they make use of it and fit them to the times. And so what Jerry Brown 2.0 is doing with climate change is essentially taking ideas developed in the urban strategy, applying to them to what we know about today and the challenges that we face today, and coming up with solutions that fit the times, and I think are going to have huge ripple effects over time. And so I think, you know, I learned at the school of Peter Detweiler as well when I went to SOR, and ideas that I would bring forward were things that had been tried 8 or 10 years before, or 4 or 5 years before. And ideas that we were developing there found their way. I mean, SB 375, there's a heritage to it, and there's a rationale for it. And a lot of the people who were behind that, I mean, I look at Bill Craven, he's not here, but he was involved in those earlier efforts, and he knew how to adapt that. And from SB 375, you start seeing, okay, there's AB 32, and now there's SB 32. And so, you know, I'm still hopeful that as we learn these things, we get more wise, and we figure out how to pick up the sticks around us and put them into new configurations. So.
Thank you very much. I'm looking, is Dean Mazinski here? He was invited, and I didn't hear back from him. I thought maybe he'd snuck in, but he was also at OPR and one of the principal authors of the urban strategy. Yes. Yeah. Oh, sure. Janet?
Having been involved with David on the Wilson and Steve, I think we called it the Death March as we walked through the development of that process. I think even though it did not succeed, it did cause other things to happen. Because one of the things that came out of that for the first time in many activities that occurred was the idea of diversity, of bringing to the table for the first time people of color, people of different economic means, which had not been done before. And that caused other things to happen with many of the things that occurred within planning because of that effort. So while we didn't achieve the growth management strategy that we hoped for, we achieved other things which I think helped move the state forward. So even though we have failures at different times, there are benefits that come out of that. So that's the one comment I make. The second comment is to reiterate what Fred said, and we saw that a lot in the housing legislation that came forward, that in this last year, was new bills being introduced, had language, and then someone would say, that's already in the law. People aren't doing it, but it's already in the law. And that continual effort that people aren't reading the law and causes new terms to come up. My favorite this year is we're using the word chill. I don't know where a good new planning term. So I don't know what that means, but we'll see it. But I'm just saying, so it's that kind of thing that just reiterate that people need to go back and look what the law says, because it allows us to do a lot of things that we think we can't do, but we can do.
Let me just add a couple things to what Janet just said, because my job has been to study all these processes. I've been there and listened to them, interviewed everybody in sight, including, of course, Peter Detweiler. And I just want to say that what I see, Janet is absolutely right, that these collaborative processes like the growth management project really created relationships and understandings among all the people working in this. They knew each other, they were able to call each other, they had the same base of knowledge, and then there were many, many collaborative processes that followed that, both about growth management and most notably about water. I would say CalFed process then led to the water forum in Sacramento. So many things are really due to that social, political, intellectual capital that these people who worked on those projects found. And I can tell you from interviewing, why do you keep going to these things even though it's really boring sometimes? They say, well, I really learned so much about my field, and I find out what other people want and need, and I can call them when I need them. So it's a very, once it starts, it's just snowballs. So I'm encouraging you all to be collaborative when you can.
Thank you. Okay. No, Vivian?
Okay, I thought everybody had said everything, and maybe I'm going to pull together some of the things other people said. Larry mentioned to me last night when we talked about what he wanted us to respond to, that he thought one of the things that we still needed was unifying themes and sort of overarching principles for planning. Bill suggested that we got that from greenhouse gases, emissions. We've got it from water. What I think is missing, and what we were doing with the urban strategy, was that the whole idea of urbanization, which is sort of really integral to what planners do, I find that to be a more appropriate, unifying theme for comprehensive planning. There are issues about the ability to do comprehensive planning, and maybe we can't do it on a grand scale, but I think we still need some overall idea of what the objectives are. And the only way I think that we identify goals and objectives that cover issues like affordable housing, dealing with the polarization in society, dealing with agricultural preservation and environmental preservation, protecting water resources, improving infrastructure, that full range of things is to come up with a set of unifying planning principles and then implement that with a series of strategies. I'm concerned about backing into planning by starting out with greenhouse gas emissions and reducing them, or just planning water, no matter how important those issues are. I think starting out with that as the focal point is not the way to do comprehensive planning.
Thank you. So first, I'm going to open it up to questions and comments from the audience. We got another 10 minutes or so. But I first just want to say to the special guests we've invited and have responded to the RSVP, thank you very much. I'm really thrilled that you're here, most of you are people I've spent many years working with, and so I'm grateful that you're here, and to my panel as well. I got a note from somebody in the audience that said, there's if you paraphrase Martin Luther King Jr., there's a statement that would be kind of fit what we're talking about here. And the quote, again, not a direct quote from Martin Luther King, but a paraphrase, is, "The arc of comprehensive planning is long, but it bends toward a better future." The conclusion of our panel today. But having said that, we have another 10 minutes, and I want to invite other people to make comments, ask questions. Bob's tired.
No, I'm newly energized, Larry, as a result of this. Well, I have to confess that I convinced Larry to put in all the hard work to pull these people together, in part because I started working with Larry in 1985, and I was exposed to, not directly to all these people, but indirectly. And the history was really valuable to me. And I thought it would be really important as a generational thing in part to convey some of that history. So I think this has been fantastic. And sort of leveraging off that and maybe responding to one of the other observations, I think, well, my personal observation was that I started my career amidst a bunch of hippies, you know, these people from the 60s who were idealistic and who dreamt big and who participated in planning big. And I've seen the pendulum swing in the years since I started my career. And I think there's a lot of energy, there's a lot of idealism. I think there are a lot of people who would be perfectly willing to participate in this big picture planning, and partly, well, maybe only if they were inspired by the kind of stories that they hear today. So I invite the people who were not only born after 1980, but born after 1990 to take note of what's been said here and to think about how we can coalesce and start planning, maybe from the top down, you know, per Vivian's comments. Look at the big picture, figure out how the smaller items fit in, or the composite things in a way that maybe bubbles up to the big picture again, maybe at a regional level. So I appreciate all this. As one of the conference co-chairs, we're marking the 100th anniversary of the American Institute of Planning, right? So that was part of the underlying theme of the conference was history and the diversity that history brings to us. So that's just an observation. So thank you, guys.
Thank you, Bob. Somebody else.
We're talking about going towards regional planning, maybe not, you know, not doing state planning. So how many regions then? And do we use geography? Any thoughts on how we divide up the state?
How many regions are there?
No, I mean, well, you know, you had mentioned it went in three sections. And I'm trying to think, you know, if you go northern, central, and Southern California, there's a lot of differences in those areas. So is that the right approach to go 3 regions? Should there be 5 regions? You know, thoughts on dividing up?
I think it's like the 6 Californias, right?
Right.
Why don't we just do that?
Said that there were 10 regions.
I think that's a really hard question because there's different. Go ahead.
There were only 3 regions. I didn't mean to suggest there were 3 regions. No, it was a way of moving towards the definition of those regions. And in fact, when we worked on the state development plan, we did divide up the state of California into 13 regions. And I could dig out that map, but of course, you know, it's a question of what kind of regions, urban regions, environmental regions, and so forth. But there is a map that shows the state divided up into 13.
To add to that, does anyone remember the Council on Intergovernmental Relations? Yeah, right. Yeah, it went away for a bunch of reasons, but one of the things it was charged to do and did was to look at the state relative to those regions and how to divide them up. It did a whole bunch of work off of the good work that Paul and others had done to look at physiogeographic regions. And if you think about it today, we have physiogeographic regions and economic regions that are really close. Well, that's because of how we've urbanized over a couple of 100 years. So it makes sense to start there. Now, I think the last institutional work that was done by the Council on Intergovernmental Relations, and when it went away, I don't think it's been done, but I would go back to the OPR statute again and say there's an opportunity to do that. Whether anybody would want to do it or not is a whole nother matter.
Okay.
Rich Brasher from San Diego. My question is primarily for Bill Fulton, as well as the other planners emeriti. In the earlier discussion on the early plans for the state of California, I was reminded of some of the early plans for San Diego, such as the 1908 Nolan Plan, the subsequent one in 1926, the Lynch and Appleyard Temporary Paradise in 1974, and the update of that toward Permanent Paradise. Each of those plans had, they looked at what made the San Diego region very special and sought ways to either preserve those elements or to enhance them. And yeah, from your perspective, Bill, as a former planning director for San Diego, do you see that these plans just lack a charismatic politician to move them forward, or are they ultimately just going to be relegated to sitting on the shelf, and yeah, they're just nice plans that are prepared by by people who just want to preserve what they've got?
Well, that's a small question, isn't it? Well, you know, when Steve was talking about how many of the City Beautiful plans have a lyrical quality to them, it actually occurred to me just about the last plan in time that I can think of that has that kind of lyrical quality to it is Temporary Paradise, which was published in 1974, and that is really because it is the work of two individual, almost artists, who had a very singular view, which they were able to convey in a very vivid and a very evocative way. You know, as I have been, when I used to teach my class at UC Davis Extension, one of the lectures was the two strands of planning history in the U.S. One was by the architects, one was by the landscape architects, and one was by the lawyers, right? And I think what happens is we get inspired with all these wonderful big picture plans, which are basically by landscape architects, are people who kind of think at a landscape scale, but then planning on a day-to-day basis becomes implementing the development regulations, and that, which is a pretty soul-crushing experience in most cities, right? And you know, you go back to Nolan, and you go back to Burnham, and you go back even to Temporary Paradise. Those are not about those are not writing zoning codes and implementing land use regulations. Those are about basically how you use the public realm to frame the development of a region. And I think one of the things we've lost in having worked on my fair share of general plans, one of the things I think we've lost is the ability to have that aspect of it. We get totally caught up. And so both in my political career and in my planning career, when I've tried to argue that, oh no, the general plan has to be about infrastructure and about all sorts of other things, people say, no, it's just about you know, it's just going to set up the next zoning code. And as I say, I think that's a very diminishing thing. And so the regulation overwhelms the inspiration.
One more? We've got time for one more.
One more.
So I'm still a relative newcomer to California. I spent 25 years in a planning career in our neighbor to the north, Oregon. And one thing that really attracted me to Oregon was they had statewide planning goals. They had a clear vision of where they wanted to go. Now, I had a lot of beef about how they tried to get there and are they actually achieving those. But when I moved to California, that's the first thing I asked, and I've still asked it for 3 years since I've been here. What are our goals? What is it that we're trying to achieve? What's our vision? And today was the first time I had any inkling that there is a statewide vision at all. So I would just really advocate that we as a planning profession, if there is a goal, well, we need to create one, and we need to communicate that to the public, because if I can't figure it out, I'm sure the public can't either.
Very good.
So I think we have a wrap, and I first want to thank my panel. Thank you very much. And I want to thank our special guests. These are people who major players for many years in California state planning. Thank you for coming. And thank you all for coming. It's been a pleasure to have you. So.
Thank you.